Hey, nerds. So, going to continue my super long series on probably my favorite philosopher, Foucault's book, probably my favorite book of his, History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And yeah, of course, as many of you know, the three people who watch my channel, uh, Foucault was a famous 70s pervert philosopher, and Jordan Peterson strawmans him all the time as he and Foucault agreeing on everything, even though they actually disagreed about something. He calls post-structuralism postmodern neo-Marxism, even though post-structuralists are not postmodernists, and Marxists don't necessarily have anything to do with post-structuralists. And Derrida used deconstruction, and Foucault both used deconstruction, but Foucault used deconstruction to deconstruct the concept of God, and Derrida used deconstruction to save the concept of God. And they, like, Derrida wrote a book, Spectres of Marx, which I'm doing a series on, in which he just criticizes some of Marx's opinions and commends others and just analyzes them like a regular philosopher on any subject. But neither of them were ideological Marxists. But anyway, in History of Sexuality, Foucault keeps coming back to the point, right, that during the Enlightenment, starting in the 1600s through to the 1800s and until today, but obviously way less so, the institutions of science, religion, and government created the category of homosexual, which never existed before. And they created all of these other categories and words like perverts and fetishes and other words for masturbation and pulling out. They were declared sins by the institution of religion. They were declared biological and psychiatric flaws by the institution of science and biology, and they were declared illegal. All of these, even like anal sex between a heterosexual couple, because that's gay behavior. You see, that's not allowed. So he this is the main theme he keeps coming back to in the book, right? So we're going to get into this paragraph here, which it's a long one, but I think it's worth getting into. He's talking about the way that these people were put into categories, and then, like, these categories of fetishes and perverts and stuff, these were all created into evil categories that make you see them as biologically and psychiatrically flawed, and then their generations of children after them are going to be sinful, and all of their children will be psychiatrically flawed and sinful, and it's illegal to exist. And if you do your gay behavior, or if you're openly gay or something, you could get thrown into prison or sterilized. Like, allegedly, Alan Turing killed himself because he was forced to sterilize himself. Of course, like, was heavily involved with the invention of computer and code breaking during World War II. Of course, many people know, and it's apparently, like, debatable as to whether he killed himself because he was sterilized because he was gay, but it's possible they did, and plenty of people did throughout human history, right? So anyway, but let's get into this epic length paragraph here. Okay. In the psychiatrization, psychiatrization, he just means that psychiatry that psychiatry focused on this idea of perversions, and they psychiatrized it so that if you're a so-called pervert, then you're psychologically insane. Like, this is because this is like psychologically bad. It's like schizophrenia or something like that. Anything serious, like delusional mental state or something like that, is what perversion is, right? According to the realm of psychiatry. Okay, so in the psychiatrization of perversions, sex was related to biological functions and to an anatomo-physiological machinery that gave its meaning. So by anatomo-physiological, he's just being unnecessarily pedantic and combining anatomy and physiology. So, the idea that sex should just be purely for anatomical and physiological purposes, this is all it is. It shouldn't be fun or anything like that. anatomo-physiological machinery that gave it its meaning. That is, its finality. This is a static concept that can't be changed, a static definition of sex, apparently. Gave it its meaning, that is, its finality, but it was also referred to an instinct which, through its peculiar development and according to the subjects to which it could become attached, made it possible for perverse behavior patterns to arise and make their genesis intelligible. Oh no. So, since sex is supposed to be purely biological, like sexual instincts are bad. So, sex should only be for procreation. It shouldn't be fun in any way. So, perversion is bad because you're not procreating and following God's law and being like a psychologically healthy person, according to the people in that culture at the time. Okay. So, made it possible perverse behavior patterns to arise and made their genesis intelligible. So, you see, perverse behavior patterns, like people doing so-called perverted shit. Like if you're talking about back in the 1600s or even the 1800s, perverted shit could be like pretty tame stuff nowadays to a lot of people. Like what? Like pulling a girl's hair, or a guy liking to be tied up, or that's like mild to perverts like me nowadays. So okay, so we'll continue here. And made their genesis intelligible, perverse behavior intelligible. Thus, quote unquote, sex was defined by the interlacing of function and instinct, finality and signification. So this final static definition of sex interlaces function and instinct. So the sole purpose of sex is instinct and biological function and procreation. Moreover, this was the form in which it was manifested more clearly than anywhere else in the model perversion, in that fetishism, quote unquote, which from at least as early as 1877 serves as the guiding thread for analyzing all the other deviations. Okay, so they put all of these different behaviors, and the examples that he uses here, coitus interruptus, or pulling out, and onanism, or masturbation. That's a new word I learned today. Old-fashioned word for masturbation. And all of these things are perversions. And then, of course, like being gay or bisexual is a perversion, or any other abnormal behavior, like pretty much anything other than missionary sex between a heterosexual man and woman for the strict purposes of procreation. That's all that's allowed. Anything else is perversion, basically, or anything else is a fetish. And you know so they lumped all of these into the category of fetishism, and then they analyzed all sexual behavior that they diagnosed as abnormal as fetishism. So in it, one could clearly perceive the way in which the instinct became fastened to an object in accordance with an individual's historical adherence and biological inadequacy. So that seems like a recipe for a fetish, right? Then he's talking about becoming fastened to an object, and and it's attached to historical adherence to biological inadequacy. So if you feel like sexually inadequate, and you want to, then you're also flawed, right? Or if you're sexually inadequate, that makes you fearful of not performing, so that you become fascinated with one particular object, and you're only turned down by couches or some random shit, right? Okay. And this was deemed like a sin and a psychological flaw and illegal, even though that's weird, but who fucking cares? It doesn't have anything to do with you. Okay. So served as a guiding thread for analyzing all the other deviations. In it, one could clearly in it, one could clearly perceive the way in which the instinct became fastened to, I read that part, to in to an object in accordance with an individual's historical adherence and biological inadequacy. Lastly, in the socialization of procreative behavior. So this idea that procreative behavior is all that sex should be for, right? The socialization of procreative behaviors, quote unquote, sex, was described as being caught between a law of reality, economic necessity being its most abrupt and immediate form. So people have to only use sex for procreation so they can become good, economically contributing members to society so they can pay taxes and we can all live in our supposed democratic harmony, right? So economic necessity being its most abrupt and immediate form, and an economy of pleasure, which was always attempting to circumvent the law. Oh no, these people are trying to have pleasure with sex. That's illegal. They're bad people. Lock them up. When that is, it did not ignore it altogether. So pleasure wasn't ignored altogether, though. Everyone knows that people seek pleasure during sex, whether it's illegal or a sin or psychologically flawed or not, right? And sometimes you get like the Streisand effect or whatever in terms of when something's a taboo, people want to do it more. I don't think that's actually a Streisand effect, but it's a similar type of thing. Uh, Economic necessity being basically sex's most abrupt and immediate form, and an economy of pleasure which was always attempting to circumvent that law. When that is, it did not ignore it altogether. The most notorious of quote unquote frauds, I don't know why he puts that in quotes because I agree that it's a fraud. And more stories of frauds, coitus interruptus, which means pulling out to avoid getting a woman pregnant, represented the point where the insistence of the real forced an end to pleasure. Yeah. So if you don't want to do that, then that's bad because you shouldn't like I guess if, like you're interrupting pleasure if you're doing that. So like, obviously, if a man comes inside a woman, then maybe that's obviously more pleasurable. I don't know why I said maybe. And an economy and so the most notorious of frauds, coitus interruptus, represented the point where the insistence of the real forced an end to pleasure and where the pleasure found a way to surface despite the economy dictated by the real. So the supposed real. So the supposed reality is that you should only have sex for the sole purposes of procreation to be a good contributing member of society and pay your taxes in our noble democracy. Um, and remember, that's another good side note about Foucault. He I mention this quote all the time. He literally says the only fatal form of no government is the only fatal form of power. And Jordan Peterson keeps saying he's a fucking Marxist, even though he sounds like a fucking anarchist, doesn't he? Okay, so coitus interruptus represented the point where the insistence of the real forced an end to pleasure and where the pleasure found a way to surface despite the economy dictated by the real. It is apparent that the deployment of sexuality with its different strategies, so the weaponization of this concept of sexuality, right? Sexualizing everything in order to diagnose it psychologically and biologically, and in order to look at it from a religious perspective in terms of whether it's a sin, and to look at it from a legal perspective in terms of whether it should be legal or not. The deployment of sexuality with its different strategies was what established this notion of quote unquote sex, and in the four major forms of hysteria, like hysterical forms of perverts, or fetishes, you should say. Four major forms of hysterical, like, diagnoses of fetishes, basically. Onanism, which is that new word for masturbation that I learned. Onanism, fetishism, like, these are all kind of fetishes according to them. Onanism, fetishism, or anything unusual. Like, I mean, like, who knows? Probably even like spanking and hair pulling back then, or even oral sex for sure. Yeah. And remember, did I mention, yeah, that anal sex even between a heterosexual couple was a sin and psychologically flawed and illegal because that's gay behavior. Yeah, I did mention that. Fetishism and so onanism, masturbation, fetishism, and interrupted coitus or pulling out showed this sex to be governed by the interplay of whole and part, principle and lack, absence and presence, excess and deficiency. So you see what he means? He's meaning that whole and part. So there's this whole idea of sex as a concept, like a biological, psychological, religious, and legal concept. But it's also people in reality are not accepting this supposed reality, and they're actually doing their naughty sexual behavior behind closed doors, right? So principle and lack. So you're a principled person if you have missionary sex for the sole purpose of procreation so you can pay your taxes and raise people who will pay their taxes in the future. Principle and lack, absence and presence. So, like abstaining from sex, but also actually having sex, or pretending or claiming to be abstinent, but actually having sex, which often happens, right? A modern day example, obviously, you could think about priests in the Catholic Church raping little kids. And so excess and deficiency by the function of instinct, finality, and meaning, of reality and pleasure. Of reality is pleasure. Because you see, in this reality at the time, pleasure is not supposed to be reality. So reality and pleasure, because pleasure is separate from reality. So if you like pleasure, then that's not real. So people are pursuing pleasure against the desires of the institution of government, science, and religion. And that's what happens. Whether you make rules about sex or not, people are going to have sex. People always do naughty things behind closed doors. That's basically Foucault's point in this, in a nutshell, which he always expresses in an unnecessarily verbose, pedantic, and obtuse way, of course, right? But that's basically my main takeaway from this. Do all your naughty fetishes and pervert shit. Who gives a shit? That shit is legal now, and it's not. Well, plenty of people still think it's a sin, and plenty of people think that some of it is psychologically flawed. But who gives a shit? You know, let your freak flag fly. That's what Foucault would say, because he literally was a gay man who died of AIDS in the 80s from having unprotected sex. Not recommended behavior. Probably should have safe sex. But yeah, let your freak flag fly, brah.